Thank you for joining us for this look at the best original reporting from KPBS News this week. I'm John Carroll. Coming up, summer might be over, but the heat is still with us. Investigative reporter Claire Tregesser looks into why it might be harder to find a public pool to cool off in this weekend. A scientific breakthrough at the San Diego Zoo. Environment reporter Eric Anderson explains how a new Egyptian vulture is a milestone for conservation efforts. And a trip inside San Diego's brew hive. Alexander Nguyen meets the woman who's documenting San Diego's craft beer scene. We start with progress in the COVID-19 pandemic as a key public official recommends booster shots. The director of the Centers for Disease Control says it's a good idea for certain high-risk groups to get the extra dose of the vaccine. That includes those who work in healthcare, caregivers, and those who are working in a homeless shelter or in prisons. Booster shots are for those who received their initial shots at least 6 months ago. Tens of thousands of college students are back on campus at UC San Diego after a year and a half of remote learning. KPBS education reporter MG Perez was there on move-in day and tells us why COVID is still very much a concern.
In the sea of students flooding the UC San Diego campus, there are clear signs everywhere that COVID-19 is still with us. This fall, masks and mandates are just as important as studying and grade point average. 18-year-old Justin Leong is a freshman moving into the dorms with help from his mother and father. They are a fully vaccinated family who traveled here from their home in the San Francisco Bay Area.
I'm definitely excited to be learning in person and getting the experience that I didn't get to have my last year of high school.
Justin is one of more than 32,000 students enrolled this semester. They are all required to be vaccinated with very limited medical exceptions. The university is also moving some classes outdoors, testing wastewater for COVID, and masks are not negotiable, which is some comfort to Justin's mother.
That's the only thing that really I'm worried about my son being in campus. But at the same time, I'm excited that he gets to meet friends.
UCSD has taken a lead in COVID protocols since the initial shutdown in March 2020. That leadership continues this fall. Even vaccinated students will be required to take a COVID test once a week for the first month of classes. Unvaccinated students will be tested twice a week.
I'm confident because we're in community through the contributions of our students, faculty, and staff, and then adapting based on what we learn from the science.
The Leongs are happy their son is part of this community where he will study chemical engineering. His mother leaves him with some simple advice.
Just always make the right decision, be smart, and and we're always here for him.
Reassuring words in a challenging time of uncertainty. MG Perez, KPBS News.
That's one of several pandemic stories told this week by our reporters here at KPBS News. You can find all of our reports and a map of local vaccine locations on the Tracking COVID-19 page at kpbs.org. Just click the link on our homepage. San Diego State students are also back on campus, and some are expanding their minds with a style of literature not often used for higher learning. KPBS Arts reporter Beth Accomando shows us what comic books can teach us about critical thinking.
So how does a professor get students to sign up for a class with the dull title of English 157? Well, change the name.
I call it psychedelic mirrors, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. They say that the humanities are dying, but it's just not true. We just haven't marketed them in the right way.
William Noricchio is a professor of English and comparative literature at San Diego State University, and his marketing worked on Annika Huff.
Psychedelic mirrors was something out of the ordinary, and it was something that, mirrors, looking into yourself, self-discovery, looking through the eyes of someone who could possibly be on psychedelics, just a very, very strange, very rare and unique name for a course.
The course looks to history and comics.
The focus of the class is on the human psyche and how a group of brilliant artists like Robert Crumb and Dan Klaus, how they depict the intricacies of the human mind, but in comic books.
Now, a course on comic books might make some taxpayers think their money's being wasted, but it's not, says student Mei Yen Sung.
Comics may seem not as important as other academic subjects, but I feel like comics is something that's very interactive, and some people who might be more visual learners or some people who see comics as entertainment can also get educational value, and they could also see a lot of information and other things through comics.
I think it's more than just comics. I think it's critical thinking. I think it's analyzing text that one might just overlook as something that's a bunch of cartoons. I mean, I think it's important to always think for yourself, and that comes with critical thinking, and that's what fake news and TikTok and Instagram have kind of stripped people of recently, is their ability to think for themselves.
Naricio sees comics as a way to get these students to think.
Yeah, could that woman be like, in a way, a metaphor for Kafka's family or his friends?
And for this class to think critically about how the images they see can affect them.
Robert Crumb is at great pains to show us where racism grows, and it grows through entertainment. What we're seeing are two young people on the streets of Prague watching an early form of a motion picture. Today, I was lecturing on how Robert Crumb, an underground cartoonist, frames an early form of motion pictures to show how susceptible people are to being racist pigs. If we see it in the movies, we're going to believe it. If we hear it on TV, we're going to believe it. If we see it on the internet, we're going to believe it.
Bill is not just a consumer of images, he's also challenges the students to deeply understand images.
I think it's why I was asked to teach a class about comics.
And also the world is awash with information, disinformation, and it's important to teach people to understand what the message is through the image, but also understand what the implications are of the image itself, and to think deeply through, okay, so I'm consuming this image, what does it mean for my thoughts? What does it mean for my actions?
I don't have the answer. Each one of us will be confronted by ambiguities every day. Write that down. Unapologetic curiosity. If anything, literature prepares us much more for life than a course in botany.
Instead of trying to find a specific answer, you're really just broadening your own world perspective and the concepts and ideas that you might have already to become a more mature person. And so not necessarily as much about finding a specific answer, but maybe becoming someone who's more open-minded and overall well-rounded.
That's why we need classes like Psychedelic Mirrors.
Literature is one of the last places in the university for open dialogue, thought, and conflict. Thoughtful conflict, disagreement, argument, polemic. We've never had more of a need for our students to have the critical capacity to evaluate information.
Beth Accomando, KPBS News.
It's been hot in San Diego this September, but for families hoping to cool off at one of the city's 13 public pools, they're probably out of luck. KPBS investigative reporter Claire Tregesser found the city has drastically cut back its weekend pool hours since 2019.
You want to do backwards or forwards? Wow, look at this. Sharon Reeser and her 3-year-old daughter Clara are practicing their swimming at a public pool in Tierrasana. It's past 5 o'clock on a Friday, and Clara's lips are turning a little blue. It's late in the day for swimming, but they're fitting it in when they can. That's because this pool is not open on weekends.
Saturday swimming would be great because it's difficult with work schedules and school schedules to make it to swim sessions that are during the day.
But across the city, there are hardly any weekend pool hours where kids can swim, and that's a big cutback from previous years. The city of San Diego has 13 public pools. In September 2019, all but one of them had weekend recreational swim hours. In total, across all city pools, there were 50 hours when kids could swim on the weekends. Pools were mostly closed last summer due to COVID. Now, this September, there are just 3 pools with recreational swim hours in Claremont, La Jolla, and San Ysidro. Each pool is open for 2.5 to 5 hours total each weekend.
I was planning to go to that pool on Saturday. I thought as I was pulling out, I should call and see if it is open.
Scott Pollock recently brought his 4-year-old son Felix to the city pool in Tierrasana on a Saturday. The website said it was open, but it wasn't.
There is a level of frustration with it not being open. but more so there's a frustration around the level and lack of communication.
The pool had switched from its summer hours to fall hours, but hadn't changed the website. Many of the city's public pools ended their weekend hours after Labor Day. That despite the fact that September is usually one of the hottest months in San Diego, with higher average temperatures than in June or July. And in previous years, city pools stayed open on weekends in September.
So it's very important for children to be physically active.
Noe Crespo is a public health professor at San Diego State University. He says children of color and children in lower income neighborhoods are less likely to know how to swim and less likely to be physically active overall.
It's an unfortunate scenario that depending on where your child lives, then that will determine if they have access to a pool, if they have access to sports.
He says exercise helps kids physically, but also improves their mental health and performance in school. And cities should be responsible for providing those facilities to their residents.
Cities are responsible to provide the resources in different locations and to look at also equity.
A spokesperson for the city of San Diego wouldn't do an interview about the change in pool hours, but he sent an email saying the change is because the city is short-staffed. This is actually a nationwide issue, not only with pools and lifeguards, but with many businesses that utilize young workers to provide services to their customers, he said. The reality is, without the aquatic staff to provide programming and pool guard duties, it's not possible to keep the facilities as open as long as we'd like and provide a safe environment for the public. The city pays pool lifeguards $15 to $17 an hour. To staff weekend pools at previous levels would cost less than $10,000 a year, according to the most recent city budget. Sharon Reeser, the Tirisana resident, is also thinking about costs. Since she can't go to her local city pool on the weekends, she's left with buying day passes at private pools, which could cost $60 for her family of 4, or joining the YMCA.
It's expensive, whereas the city pools, they're fun, they get great facilities.
Her daughter, Clara, would especially like to use the splash pad at the Tirisana pool, but it's only open a few days a week from noon to 3, when Clara is in school. Claire Tregesser, KPBS News.
Science is driving the news most popular with readers on our website, kpbs.org. Some of the most read stories include California reaching the nation's lowest COVID-19 transmission rate. Also, San Diego's earthquake-prone areas. How a newly released map will help us make important decisions on where we build. And the San Diego Zoo has done something no other North American zoo has managed to do. Eric Anderson shows us how zookeepers helped hatch an endangered Egyptian vulture.
Daisy Rivas walks between large wired enclosures in a quiet area on the eastern edge of the San Diego Zoo Safari Park.
Hi guys, good morning.
This off-exhibit area is home to a pair of striking white vultures. The male, with fluffy white plumage, sits on a perch surveying Rivas. The female, on the ground, but at a distance.
They are such special vultures. They're the only tool-using vultures, so they're very smart birds. They use rocks to break open ostrich eggs. They take a lot of the different parts of the carcass that larger birds can't get to. So they just play a really important part in the ecosystem.
Interaction like this is limited because Rivas wants the birds to keep their healthy distrust of people. In fact, much of the monitoring happens inside a shed out of the bird's sight. There's a cabinet with video screens that monitor all the enclosures.
So we have the opportunity to look at a lot of the birds' behavior without disturbing them too much. So we actually have cameras on a lot of our nesting areas. So this is a great view of our nesting area for the breeding pair of Egyptian vultures.
An elevated square box serves as a nest. The birds typically clear a flat, rocky area to lay an egg. Inside the plywood shelter, there is a barrier that can keep the eggs from falling. The nest is screened from a pair of territorial palm nut vultures that are in the next enclosure.
But it's also good for them to not be able to see these guys when they're sitting so that they don't get distracted. But they can see them anywhere else they're perching, and they can make sure they're protecting the area from the other birds nearby.
The mating pair has done something not accomplished before in North America. They produced and fertilized an egg, which hatched earlier this year. Park's lead condor care specialist, Ron Webb, showed us the trailer where the endangered chick was puppet-fed. Jamila, as she's been named, was brought to this feeding station in a small white bowl filled with snuggly animal hair. Those faint squeaks told keepers that she was hungry and ready to eat.
We have the one-way windows in here, so as long as this light's on and this light's off, she can't see us, and we can see her.
The feedings started with a simple sock puppet and a pair of tweezers.
Old world vultures tend to take more food directly from the parents' beaks. They'll eat through regurgitation, but they also take little bits. So we do actually pick up pieces of food and hand it to the chick.
As the bird grew, the sock puppet was replaced by a more realistic one that staff used to care for condor chicks.
When they're young, it's easy. When they get older, they start pulling on them and yanking, and like they do with the parent's skin in the nest box.
That tiny tan chick is now fully fledged and a bit nervous with human visitors. Jamila grabs the fence and pumps her wings as if to let everyone know this is her territory. Her dark brown plumage, by the way, will eventually become white like her parents. The vulture's arrival is being cheered by international conservation groups.
Yes, it is very welcome to have a broader network of zoos that have that species and can potentially provide birds for release programs.
Stefan Oppel is a conservation scientist for the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds. He says more than half of the vulture's population has been lost to hunting, poison, and electrocution in the last 40 years. Captive breeding only happens in a handful of locations in Europe and Israel, and those efforts produce a small number of birds each year. Population continues falling in parts of Europe and Africa, but there are conservation successes.
In southern France and in northern Spain and on the Canary Islands, intensive conservation programs have actually managed to reverse the fortune of the Egyptian vulture by working very closely with communities, by changing the way we build electricity infrastructure.
Different types of bugs with calcium.
And while it's tough to help correct the challenges the birds are facing in the wild half a world away, Rivas hopes the breeding effort in San Diego will grow here and expand to other North American zoos. She says that'll strengthen the species' chances for survival. Eric Anderson, KPBS News.
We want to thank everyone who participated in our special virtual kickoff for this year's One Book, One San Diego. Disability rights activist Judith Heumann joined KPBS Arts calendar editor Julia Dixon Evans for a discussion about her book, Being Human. You can stream it anytime at the KPBS YouTube page. One Book, One San Diego is now in its 15th year. It's a collaboration with dozens of local libraries and public service organizations. Deep in the basement of the Kellogg Library at Cal State San Marcos sits a treasure trove of San Diego beer history. It's known as the BREWING, and it's the only one dedicated to San Diego's brewing industry. As KPBS reporter Alexander Nguyen shows us, San Diego brewing history runs deep.
Well, it's no secret that San Diego loves its craft beer, but not many people know that the history of San Diego brewing sits inside that building right there.
It's known as the BREWING, and it's the only one dedicated to San Diego's brewing scene. Located deep in the basement of Kellogg Library, it's a treasure trove of the region's beer history. There are bottle caps, coasters, tap handles, and more. And here's the lady whose job it is to archive them all.
I'm Judith Downey, and I am the History and Special Collections Librarian at Cal State San Marcos.
She's also the curator of the BREWING, but most people just know her as...
And they'll say, oh, you're the beer historian. And you know, they're always fascinated. I always try to have some kind of little hidden gem of knowledge that, you know, either busts a myth or corrects a misperception.
One of the most popular misconceptions about San Diego's brewing industry is that it started in the 1980s, but it all started in 1868 with Christian Dupler's San Diego Brewing Company.
This is kind of a secured storage area.
As Downey walks around the collection, showing off things she's collected or people have donated to the archive, you can sense how much she loves her work.
I've also got things like, and I keep saying this is the CSUSM collection, but I feel so invested in this because it's such a passion for me that I always say my collection, and it's really not.
The collection has pint glasses adorned with logos and artworks from various brewers. Some have gone out of business, others show the evolution of their logos. And the collection keeps on growing.
That's about it for this room. We do have another room down on the other end of the building that I'll take you to.
The idea for the BREWING started as early as 2015, around the time when Cal State San Marcos was starting its beer making certificate program, dubbed BREWING. It was the brainchild of Jennifer Fabi. She's the dean of the university library. As the San Diego craft beer scene exploded into a billion-dollar industry, Fabi thought it was a good idea to preserve that history. Because, as it turns out, nobody in town was.
We knew that in order to do that, we would need some resources, and we wanted to make sure that we had a collection that was very exciting to both the public and also to those internal to the university.
Fabi formed an advisory group comprised of local brewers and a filmmaker who's done a documentary on San Diego brewing to see what the archive should collect. It was the advisory group that came up with the name.
At first, we called it the Barchive because, of course, that rhymes with archive. But those people on the advisory committee, they said that won't do. Brewchive is better. So we trademarked Brewchive.
The Brewchive also benefited because a lot of brewers are passionate about their beers, so they collect a lot of keepsakes, such as Greg Cook, the founder of Stone Brewing. He donated more than 600 Bankers boxes full of stuff to the archive.
I collected a lot of stuff from Stone history along the way, and by a lot of stuff, I mean a lot of stuff, as well as from other craft breweries and places I've been, etc., etc. And I had just been collecting this in a spare room in my house, and it was overwhelmed. It was packed. I had so much stuff.
So when he was approached by the Brewchive, he jumped at the idea. He called it a symbiotic relationship. The Brewchive gets to preserve the collection, and he gets it out of the house. It's the largest donation to the Brewchive to date, though Downey says the collection is on permanent loan from Cook. While the majority of the Brewchive is dedicated to what Downey calls the third wave of San Diego brewing, the period from 1987 until 2020. She is now working on the fourth wave, the post-pandemic period. Downey is also working on preserving the history of women's involvement in the San Diego brewing industry.
I'm really trying to get women's stories. Because women's history is still not well represented.
Alexander Nguyen, KPBS News.
We hope you enjoyed this look at KPBS News this week. For all of us here at KPBS, I'm John Carroll. We leave you with the final installment of the KPBS Summer Music Series, which you can also find on the KPBS YouTube page. Let's hear now some gospel music from San Diego's own Martin Luther King Jr. Community Choir.
I'm Ken Anderson. I'm the director of the Martin Luther King Jr. Community Choir San Diego, more commonly known as the MLK Choir. I also direct the gospel choir at UCSD. The community choir, other than singing, of course, as any choir does in concerts, we also have a goal of supporting and promoting the arts. So we provide scholarships for graduating high school seniors who are continuing exclusively in the visual and performing arts. From the Negro spirituals come rag, swing, jazz, blues, rock and roll, American country music, soul, pop, disco, even on down to hip hop and rap. All of these styles, many of these styles came out of a style that came from the Negro spiritual. They all eventually find their ultimate roots back in the Negro spiritual. One thing about it, there's one style of music that comes from the Negro spiritual, gospel. One thing about working with MLK Choir and UCSD Gospel Choir, it affords me an opportunity to work with a lot of singers, perhaps who would not be able to pass an audition to get into some of these other fine choirs. They get to become a part of a choir and develop and essentially become a fine choir themselves. I love that, how gospel music affords a singer on any musical level, whatever your musicianship,